all these models. Now, to an extent, that may be true, but they're saying in the absolute sense, because there is no creator, no one else defined it, we defined it ourselves. Or you could say maybe our biological constitution is somehow helping to define that. And whereas in the other models, there's absolute moral principles. So there are certain things that are good, and there are certain things that are bad, absolutely. And then, of course, there are those things which are relative to situations which maybe necessity deems exceptions. If you study jurisprudence in any religion, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, you'll realize that. And then this was the third effect will be that you kind of feel that the world is cruel, where the criminals will get away. You can expand this example, but basically, if somebody gets away with the crime, we're going to say crime doesn't pay. Technically, if you get away with it, right, it paid, right? Because you got away, right? No one got you, right? So it's a nice term. It's a good way to educate, people. It is true, but the perception you're going to have on the world is that it really sucks because these things kind of happen. The world is not perfect, and that sucks, right? So the other model is saying that there's absolute justice, where everyone will get what they deserve in the end. So once they pass away, they'll be judged. Now this is not necessarily the theist wouldn't agree with that because they don't have a specific religion, so they haven't defined that. This goes beyond. But generally, the people who do follow religion, once they adapt this model, they have this idea in their mind. So the conclusion, and then we're going to get to the question and answers. Conclusion. So Charles Darwin, he wrote in a letter to one of his friends, he says, "The belief in natural selection must at present be grounded entirely on general considerations. When we descend to details, we cannot prove that a single species has changed, nor can we prove that the supposed changes are beneficial, which is the groundwork of the theory." Lastly, is a very interesting quote, one of my favorite quotes from Professor Ali Demirsoy, who's a strong supporter of the theory of evolution. It says, "The probability of the formation of a cytochrome C sequence, which is an enzyme essential for life, is as likely as zero." Okay? Otherwise, some metaphysical powers beyond our definition should have acted in its formation. To accept the latter, to accept that these metaphysical powers acted, is not appropriate to the goals of science. So I'm asking, what is the goal of science? We therefore have to look into the first hypothesis. But basically what he's saying is that the probability of a natural or a materialistic explanation is virtually 0%. And the probability of a supernatural explanation is virtually 100%. But we will have to continue to look into the first, because the second one, that's, even though it's virtually 100% chance probability of being correct, it's not appropriate to the goals of science. So everyone needs to ask themselves, what are the goals of science? So I leave you with that question for yourself. What are the goals of science supposed to be? But to the Darwinist, the idea is accepted without a ripple of doubt because the paradigm takes precedence. No matter what happens, whatever you find, the paradigm will always take precedence. You must have faith in the theory. So just a quote from the Quran, as they say, "We found our predecessors following this way and we will follow in their footsteps." And then someone said, "What? Even if I bring you something better than what your predecessors followed?" And they said, "We deny that with which you have been sent. The truth has come and the falsehood has disappeared. In the end, truth overcomes falsehood." And you'll be able to find the audio recording of this lecture on my website, mustafaomar.com. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Brother Mustafa, for the presentation. Thank you all for listening attentively throughout the whole program. Is the pizza here yet? I am. Okay.
I was over an hour and a half, right?
Okay. So the pizza's not here yet, but the pizza is coming, right? Yeah, the pizza is coming. So we can go ahead and get started with our Q&A session. One second. Okay. WordPress.com. There is going to be an audio recording of today's lecture, and also we can participate on more questions and answers on the website. Just a few ground rules for the question and answer session. We'll start off with one question per person. It's not a debate, so please ask your question, give Mustafa time to answer, and then we can move on there. And if we have time, we can get to one question per person. So So let's start off with the Q&A. Go ahead.
Okay. Earlier in your presentation, you mentioned that life developed by random chance. And I would challenge you to find any serious evolutionary biologist that claims life developed by random chance, when in fact they all claim that natural selection purposefully selected those traits that would most likely be passed on to the next generation. I want you to find me a biologist that claims that random chance started life.
Okay, so you're saying that it's not random chance, but it's natural selection which selected it, right? Right. Well, it's just a way of defining it, basically. So what you're saying is that random chance and natural selection are somehow different. But what I'm saying basically is that natural selection is a natural mechanism which is found in nature, which is considered the blind force of nature, because we don't contribute consciousness to nature. So therefore, even if it is natural selection that's causing this to happen, it's still considered chance formation. Chance in the sense that it's not being consciously done. So it's being randomly, it's like somebody throwing a bunch of sticks on the floor, right? And you say that's chance. And you say, well, there could be some mechanism, there could be some air flowing, or there could be something going on, but in reality, it turns out to be the same thing. If you want to call it chance, if you want to call it natural selection, we're still talking about something that's unconscious formation.
Next question. In the back. Wait, sure. Okay.
How would you explain the role of organs like the appendix that have no use to our body?
Yeah. So that's a very good question. It's a very common question. Is that what people call the vestigial organs? Now this is important because people actually use this argument a lot. And what's important is, like I said, there's two models. Okay, basically what we're doing is whatever evidence we find, whatever we discover in science, we're placing into one of these models. So if you want to place it, what the evolutionists have done is they've taken their model and they say, well, there are these organs that we don't understand how they're working within a specific living being, and we're going to put them into our model, and we're going to call them vestigial organs. These vestigial things, meaning that we don't know their purpose, they must have been from a previous species. Now the problem with this is there were several vestigial organs. Just look at the human body, for example. Look at a human being. There was in 1890, there was about 100 vestigial organs. Okay, and as time went by, we kept realizing that, these are not vestigial organs at all. They keep on developing over time. Over time, we realize what they're doing. So they get off the list, and the shopping cart eventually becomes empty. So basically, everything has been going out of the shopping cart, and the only thing that's left now, recently, they say is the appendix, right? So they say the appendix now. So for example, there's two ways to do it. One, you could say, well, we're still going to go with our theory of vestigial organs, and we're going to keep it in our model. Or what the other people will say, in the other model, the creationist model, is that, it's not a vestigial organ, it's just that you don't understand what it does. That's all it is. You just haven't figured it out yet, and because you haven't figured one thing out, you're going to claim that it's somehow evidence for evolution. Now, in fact, many scientists now say that the appendix and the tonsils, which are another one that's on the list, they both actually are very helpful in fighting infections, and they're still performing research on that. So that's how you explain these two things.
But actually, I think there's one more. I'll let you go.
My question is, you got the evidence for evolution. Can you give me any evidence for the other side? Is there any evidence that there was a blind person's fall?
Right, well, it's an inference, right? So it's like an archaeologist, for example. When an archaeologist goes to a site and he discovers a clay pot that's properly formed, what does he say? He says, this indicates that there was life at this point. When they find primitive tools, right? All scientists do. When they find primitive tools, they say, well, this is evidence that life was there. So it's an inference. And the same inference takes place. So like I said before, the model that was present before Darwin's time was this exact model based upon these inferences. The only difference is it was replaced by another model. So you can argue as what constitutes evidence. Like many people say, if God exists, then why can't I see him? They say that, right? And the same thing, just because you can see it, just because you saw the egg, for example, doesn't mean that, Piltdown Man is something. So it depends on how you define evidence. But